Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makbool with you at BTV World. In today's show, we're going to be taking a look at two important stories. The first is in reference to the Supreme Court ruling with regards to military trials against civilians involving, of course, the May 9th riots. And this is something that was earlier in a previous verdict given by the Supreme Court declared null and void. But now a six-member bench of the Supreme Court in a 5-1 majority verdict has announced that it is going to conditionally suspend the October 23rd unanimous ruling, which nullified the trials of 104 civilians pending a final judgment. And this is important, especially with regards to how exactly will this eventually transpire in terms of the people who have been waiting trial for about 7 months now and how they would be proceeded against. And of course, the involvement of military factors against which, of course, military trials are there to be able to go through the entire procedure. This also provides the provision that the final verdict rests with the Supreme Court and not with the military court. So the conditional suspension exists with the trials going as they were and allowing the military courts to proceed as they were against those civilians involved in the May 9th riots that targeted military installations and property, and of course giving the factor of being able to appeal against it in the final verdict in the Supreme Court. So this is going to be an important factor in terms of deciding how exactly will these military courts and trials proceed further, what is going to be the decision and outcome, and how exactly will that impact the proceedings. It also brings up a lot of legal questions as to how exactly this particular decision has come about and what sort of factors were considered in terms of the bench formations previously and now, and then also the kind of legalities that exist and why exactly are the military trials necessary for certain individuals. So we're going to be talking about all of this in our first segment and try and understand the legal consequences of these decisions as well as how it's going to impact the trials of those involved in the May 9th riots. We're also in our next segment going to be taking a look at international developments, particularly when we talk about the relationship between India and the United States. Something, of course, that has been impacted since a plot was thwarted by the U.S. authorities and also publicly announced in terms of credible evidence being there with the U.S. authorities against Indian involvement to assassinate an American citizen as part of the Khalistan movement. And this is, of course, something that has happened in the aftermath of the assassination already taking place in Canada, but apparently has also been planned prior to that. So we're going to be taking a look at how this development is proceeding further with the new news that we have gotten now that the U.S. administration has also said that the president will not be taking part in India's Republic Day celebrations, and it's going to skip that because of the kind of activities and investigation that is going on in the aftermath of this assassination plot. And this is important, especially in terms of how the consequences of this particular measure are now panning out and what exactly is going to be the move forward in terms of long-term impact on India and U.S. relations. How exactly will the internal investigation that the U.S. authorities are waiting for going to be carried out, how independent and credible that will be, and what sort of results will then impact the kind of consequences that exist, not just bilaterally, but also in terms of India's position in the international arena, particularly given the fact that the information is also being shared very closely with Canadian authorities and the rest of the world as well. So we're going to be taking a look at what this means in terms of what kind of message will it give to the world and to India as well if what it declares to be its strongest ally, the leadership of which is not going to be part of the Republic Day celebrations and most likely skipping the Quad Summit as well, which of course is also something that India wants to put forward in January. This is something, of course, that might also impact its own position at the summit. So we're going to be taking all of that into account and trying and see where we stand today in terms of where the investigation is going and how exactly will this impact India's position and its relationship with the U.S. For this and more, as always, I've been joined in the studios by senior analyst Raja Faisal. I've also been joined online by senior analyst Farooq Matafi, and we've been joined online by our guest legal expert, Mr. Mohammed Munib Muneeb Qadir for our first segment regarding the Supreme Court's ruling. Thank you, Muneeb, for joining us and being part of the discussion. And I'll start with you because, of course, we want to dissect and understand the legalities of this case and what exactly has transpired and how did this ruling actually come about. We know that in a previous ruling on October 23rd, which was unanimous, it was decided that the military courts are going to be declared null and void against the civilians. But now, of course, a 6-member bench and a 5-1 majority verdict has conditionally suspended that ruling and has allowed the military trials to proceed as they were previously as well. So I want your take, first of all, in dissecting these two verdicts and helping us understand why exactly has this ruling come out.
So I had predicted this, a few weeks ago when I got to know that there was an intra-court appeal. It's because the case by by the appellants this time around, by the Attorney General or from the provincial caretaker governments as well as the Shodha Forum, I think that the case was very strong. If you look at the law, particularly Article 8.3 of the Constitution, that in itself gives a lot of discretion to the executive, including the army and the police forces, to be able to maintain law and order situation. And in that, whenever it's about law and order situation and maintaining the security of the state, the fundamental freedoms contained in Chapter 1 of the Constitution are subject to that larger aim at hand, which is that the army has to be vested with powers that are necessary to ensure national security. So there's that discretion. Also, there was no detailed reason given by the Supreme Court in its 23rd October verdict, as to which constitutional provision was violated in relation to Section 2D1 of the Pakistan Army Act, for instance. Although the detailed verdict is yet to be released and come out in the public, but even in the verdict, the short verdict that was released on 23rd October, there was no good reason given behind declaring military trials of civilians related to 9th May riots to be unconstitutional. Unconstitutional exactly how? Because I just cited a particular provision within the Constitution that itself vests very wide powers with the army. Also, there was a technical flaw in the 23rd October verdict, which was that the Supreme Court Practice and Procedures Act was not followed. There was no three-member committee that was formed in deciding the bench that was to then deal with the military trial case. So there was that technical error as well. So owing to all these reasons, I believe that it was all but obvious that the decision on 23rd October that was declared by the Supreme Court was liable to be set aside, and that's exactly what has happened. What has happened is that it's been suspended, the 23rd October verdict, and so military trials of civilians who are implicated in, around 103 civilians who are implicated in the 9th May riots, can go ahead, subject to, of course, a final Supreme Court order, which shall be forthcoming in January. So I think it's pretty straightforward.
All right. Muneeb, I also want to understand what you said earlier in terms of the detailed verdict not being out yet. And the discussion also took place as part of the hearing as to whether or not this should be waited for until after it comes out that another ruling is actually being given. And of course, it was decided not to. But I also want to understand why that is the case. One reason, of course, was that the people are waiting trial for a long time. But in terms of kind of understanding why exactly the previous verdict came out, wasn't that also a possibility that we could have waited for the detailed verdict?
Not quite, because I think that was something that could have contravened Article 10A of the Constitution itself. Justice delayed is justice denied. So until and unless the question of whether the military trials can go ahead, until and unless the procedural aspects of the matters could be dealt with by the Supreme Court with finality, you could not have left justice hanging in the balance, particularly for those 103 civilians who are accused. So in any case, it makes sense that before the Supreme Court can decide on the procedural aspects of military trials of civilians, at least, the substantive aspects of those cases, which have been now lying for a very long time and are awaiting a final verdict, on the substantive, on the merits, on the substantive issues, the trials should go ahead. So that's exactly what today's Supreme Court decision has done.
All right. Farooq, I'd also like your perspective on this, especially given the fact that we've been, of course, talking about the May 9th riots and the kind of atrocities and violence that took place, and how exactly this needs, of course, a serious consequence and measure as well. And the involvement of the particular number of civilians that are undergoing trial through the military courts is different from the, I think, the larger number of civilians that are also going through trial in civilian courts and military courts as well. And so the distinction there is being made. And so it's important perhaps to understand why that is taking place and how only certain individuals are targeted. So when we talk about the fact that there is some sort of military involvement, which is why military courts are in place, and why is this still being questioned in terms of not being fair to the civilians or certain people protesting against this particular ruling as well, including the Lahore Bar Association that has also talked about a boycott tomorrow. So I want to understand, when a distinction is being made, does this not then allow for the civilians who are not involved in any sort of military factors to not be part of that trial?
So I assume that by military factors you mean national security, right? And that is very important. You have to realize one thing. Usually the argument is that you have to actually keep the lanes apart. You have to be institutionalist, that everything should work under clear, well-defined rubric of that department, right? And that means that civilians are taken care of by the civilian courts, and the military affairs are, of course, taken care of by the military courts. But in national security cases, things are, there are exceptions that are made all over the world. For example, when 9/11 happened, in the US, we saw FISA courts were created, and those FISA courts essentially gave special permits for the kind of activity that we could not even expect from a developed world country, right? In Pakistan, there is another problem. Our civilian courts, when you talk about higher or superior judiciary, that we know knows its business and is very confident. But when you talk about the lower courts, there you might see a lot of problem. Particularly when it comes to influentials or terrorists or people who might be involved in illicit activity, they can pressure not only the witnesses but even the judges. So in that state of affairs, it becomes essential that a court that takes care of these matters is the one that cannot be easily intimidated. And that is why when, a few years ago, APS Peshawar took place, at that time also we know that terrorists were tried in military courts. And that is what is important here as well, because the country has been politically polarized. There's always a chance the people that are in lower courts might also be influenced by certain biases. So a military court takes care of that problem, and I think that eventually this issue had to actually appear in the same way. Now, naturally, the last judgment that we saw did not actually give any kind of explanation why exactly they are suspending it. But now, because the Supreme Court again has taken cognizance, the matter is in the court, and it has suspended it. What we call the political fault lines are at play all over the country. The people who are actually agitating are essentially the people who have sympathies for the political party that was involved in May 9th. But regardless, it is important to remember that the matter of national security do not wait for political expediency. So eventually, whatever the courts are going to decide, we have to accept it. But for now, because they have suspended that judgment, we have to go along and we have to welcome it.
Right. Faisal, of course, I want your perspective also on this particular ruling, given the fact that previously, when we talked about the May 9th riots, this was an important factor that was discussed even then, and a lot of people spoke about how the military trials shouldn't happen. But again, when we take a look at, as Farooq was saying, matters of national security, it's important perhaps to understand what exactly is it that we are talking about and what sort of factor it is involving. Again, the military trials or military courts are part of the Constitution, as Mr. Munib was talking about, and they're there for a certain purpose. And so when we try and understand why this is happening, do you think that people understand and realize how this is part of the Constitution, how this is something that is necessary as per the Constitution, and is something that that is only distinguishing between those involving matters of national security and not the rest? And so when that distinction is made, what argument is left then? Only political?
Yeah, Sana, if we obviously talk about the people, whether they are aware of it or not, well, if we talk about obviously the lawyers and people who are part of our judicial system, people who talk about our judiciary, and the analysts who talk about the judiciary, they all know about it. People at large, of course, they won't know about it. But in a perfect world, if we talk about it, how to deal with these kind of situations, because by the way, 9th May, Pakistan faced extraordinary situations that day, and extraordinary situations required extraordinary measures. First thing which I was expecting.
But military trials are not really extraordinary measures. They were already in place. It's not like they were put in place after May 9th.
In place. But Sana, what I was expecting that day, that particular day, was what I was expecting is that instantly there will be a suo motu by obviously Supreme Court. Chief Justice would have taken suo motu, and of course a judicial inquiry of the whole menace which was seen on the roads of Pakistan that day. It should have been probed, and people who were involved, they should have been taken to the cleaners. But that did not take place, and of course then the solution must have been coming from the military side, because the military courts, of course, they have to be part of it, because the buildings which we are talking about, the institutions which we are talking about, that day they were targeted obviously by a political party and its followers. Who did it, how they did it, of course it needs to be probed, and military must do it. And that is why we saw that when military initiated it, and it was challenged in the Supreme Court, and then as Munib has rightly pointed out, that at that time hurriedly it was pushed back. But now I think it's a very smart decision, and we should not be forgetting that the final verdict would still be coming from the Supreme Court of the country. But of course, the matter should be dealt by the military courts, because military courts are the ones who are in a best position to, of course, deal with it and probe it and bring out the better justifications of why somebody should be taken to the cleaners. And the final verdict, once again, I would say that it would be coming from the Supreme Court, and I think it is the best solution, a best decision which we have seen today. And I think it is a reminder for all of the political parties and every person living in this country that nobody is above the law. And if there are extraordinary situations created by people at large or a group of a political ideology, they must understand that they will never be allowed to challenge the law of the country, and I think this is how it should be.
Right. And Munib, I want to also understand then that irrespective of what we're talking about, it seems that there are certain quarters that create the impression that this is something that is not just, is something that is happening against certain individuals because of certain motivations, and that these are just civilians and they shouldn't be tried in the military courts. And I want you to explain it to us. There was also a discussion as part of the hearing, I believe, in terms of how certain individuals are being talked about as just civilians that have gone astray, and they've just lost their path, and then parallels were being drawn with regards to terrorists or extremists in the country,
Yes.
and how exactly are you going to distinguish between those and our civilians who just perhaps made a mistake. And I want to understand then, given such debate, how does the court then decide and distinguish these individuals and put to bay the kind of reservations that are being talked about in terms of some sort of injustice that is happening reportedly?
So now that the 23rd October verdict of the Supreme Court has been set aside for the time being, we know that Section 2 of the Pakistan Army Act in its true and original form is intact. And according to that Pakistan Army Act, anybody who is involved in either causing a person subject to the Official Secrets Act to take up arms against the state or go against the state, or anyone who themselves then go against the state in the sense that they attack on military installations, those people are subject to the jurisdiction of the military courts, even if they are civilians, even if they're not otherwise subject to the Pakistan Army Act. So Section 2 is quite clear on that. And now that we know that the Supreme Court has set aside the 23rd October verdict, so that stands as it was. The line, where does one draw the line? Would it mean that in any and every case of disobedience or civil disobedience, you could, bring civilians before military courts? I think that the line to be drawn shouldn't be a very difficult one, neither an arbitrary one. The fact is simple, as Mr. Raja Faisal here just said, that what happened on 9th May was extremely exceptional. Even in Pakistan's very tumultuous political landscape, that was something unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. That such a popular political party and its followers were up, and they had created mayhem across cities and had attacked military installations. So that's the point. When your target is military installations, state institutions, then of course you will be subject to those who are, and the jurisdiction of those who are entrusted under the Constitution with the duty of upholding national security and law and order. And so in that regard, it's the transparency of such proceedings then, which is of the essence. And given the fact that the Supreme Court has reassured today that ultimately, whatever verdict that comes from the military courts is also subject to Supreme Court supervision through final Supreme Court order. And so far as there are also, rights to appeal, which there are in the law itself, there does not seem to be conflict with the right to fair trial or with constitutional principles or Article 10A of the Constitution for that matter. So yes, that is where the line should be drawn. Where you have taken up arms against the state, they also do parallels with people like Kulbhushan Jadhav and people, civilians who might go rogue and might ally themselves with foreign forces who are hostile to the nation. Then of course they're all subject to military jurisdiction. There's nothing extraordinary about it. There's been precedent way back from 1975. The Brigadier Ali judgment was cited by Attorney General Mansoor Rahman today. So the whole line of authority actually confirms the ability of military courts to exercise jurisdiction in such instances.
Right, and there's also, of course, the factor of what Faisal was pointing out of the final verdict lying with the Supreme Court, and I want to understand then that how does that fit in with how military trials normally are proceeded against certain individuals who are involved in these matters, and how will then this distinction be made for these 103, 104 civilians involved in the May 9th riots, and what sort of provision then exists for them to appeal this in the Supreme Court, and how will that impact the proceedings of the military trials?
Jurisdiction is still over ensuring that, principles of constitutionality and fair trial and due process, they've all been followed thoroughly by the military trials process. And so in that way, there's a supervisory role, which means that the procedures that were followed by the military courts during the trials of these 103 civilians or so, they themselves and in themselves were fair, were those that were befitting Pakistan's international obligations as well as Pakistan's own constitution.
Only the procedures are going
Yes.
to
Yes. Okay.
Substantive issues pertaining to the 9th May riots case, they are best left to the military because only they can assess the national security situation, which is a very important dimension to these proceedings.
Right, absolutely. Farooq, there's also, of course, the way that we have been seeing in terms of how certain actions were being carried out politically also in Pakistan prior to May 9th and then, of course, after May 9th as well. And like you said earlier, certain factions belonging to a particular party, of course, have been raising voices and talking about how this is targeted action taken against them. And a lot of the reports coming in from the media also have been pointing in the same direction. And of course, while we talk about what has happened and how this needs to be proceeded against, and now we have the Supreme Court ruling as well, despite that, there is that sort of this debate or discussion around how this is part of all the political aspects as well against a certain political party and just part of what has happened and transpired. Then how are we then able to distinguish these two and put and sort of dissect any such allegations that are being talked about in terms of the way that this is now being carried out, political environment that exists today prior to the elections, with, of course, Mr. Nawaz Sharif back in the country as well, the PMLN also gaining in terms of making alliances with different political parties, because for a lot of people, they will just be reading it from that same lens.
Right, Sana, you're right. Of course, in Pakistan, because there have been too many upheavals since its creation, there is all pervasive culture of conspiracy theories. So that is going to continue. People are going to assign various motives to various decisions or developments. But I want to actually come back to what happened on May 9th and what was happening before May 9th, right? Because that is very important and one has to actually contextualize that as well. Remember that on May 9th, the attempt was to create a kind of environment in the country that there is some kind of coup against the established order. That essentially would have led to some kind of further explosion of polarization and could even lead to a civil war. When you are trying to preserve power or come back to power through such deadly means, you cannot be up to any good. And there is a context here. For that, you have to travel further back 1 year. On April 9th, when Imran Khan was removed from power, at that time also it was clear that he was calling for a fight. He kept on calling for mass agitation. And in those days also, Sana, even though the removal process was lengthy and it was staggered, because of that, perhaps they missed the window of opportunity where they could have used the government's power to agitate or help agitators while they are standing against the state of Pakistan. But they tried to do it on the Sunday that came next. And since then, we know that they were spoiling for a fight, and they kept on repeatedly attacking various places. Even Islamabad High Court came under pressure because of the crowds and their presence whenever Imran Khan would show up. So with that kind of a situation, it was clear that there are going to be consequences, especially when a coup attempt fails. There are people, usually what happens is that people are killed and they are immediately, they face consequences. That did not happen because mercifully Pakistan has a constitution and Pakistan has a judiciary which is by and large strong and vibrant. Now, the problem with military courts, why did they have to come into existence and why did they have to actually approach this matter as well? To understand that, you have to understand what was happening during the time of Justice Bandial, because there seemed to be a special blind spot for one political party. Sana, remember that day when PTI came to Islamabad and their supporters actually set fire to various green patches in Islamabad, and there was smoke. And the Supreme Court at that time could not even see that, and they allowed these people to come to that zone. Repeatedly, Justice Bandial and his allies actually kept on creating exceptions for Imran Khan's party. And we saw that even when May 9th was happening, the next day, Imran Khan had to be produced before the court. And Justice Bandial, while allowing him to walk free, could not see what exactly had happened or was happening in the country. But that kind of situation, you actually strike at the root of trust between institutions. That was, I think, the time when it was understood that there will have to be military courts, because the people at that time in Supreme Court's echelons of power were impervious to reason and the entreaties of the institutions which were being attacked. So this had to be done. Now, how it is going to play out in elections, we still have to wait and see, Sana. It is too soon, and there are too many, variables that one has to take into account, and perhaps a longish study of discussion can take place on that.
Right. Faisal, then, of course, given that how we are able to then see what has happened prior to May 9th and then afterwards, as well as Farooq was pointed out, it's important then to understand this entire context. But when we take a look at now how exactly things are moving on, there was also a lot of discussion in terms of how the judiciary's role is and how the institutions are going to be in line with each other. And of course, we've seen a change in the leadership in the judiciary as well. And there was a lot of discussion previously from the previous leadership of showing partiality towards a certain party, and of course a lot of discussion in the parliament also in terms of bench formation and the decisions that were being made. That distinction again also of course is being drawn in terms of decisions that are coming out now with a different leadership also in place. How will then this aspect be also dealt with in light of today's ruling?
Yes, Anna, obviously, if we talk about, our judiciary, within the judiciary, I mean, it is always said that as soon as a bench is created, I mean, majority of the people, they already presume what kind of decision they are expecting, and there is a divide. And I think in the major cases, the cases of huge importance for people at large, I think the full bench is expected, and we know that, of course, the change of the Chief Justice of Pakistan now, he's very proactive and very vibrant, and I believe that his decisions, they are pivotal, and in coming days they would have a very very important impact on Pakistan's coming days and Pakistan's situations in terms of politics as well. And I believe that people at large, they must understand that whatever is taking place in terms of decisions coming out of Supreme Court, of course they are in the best of the interest of Pakistan. Whatever happened earlier this year, that was something, as Farooq earlier highlighted, it was more of a situation which once we saw Turkey was in, when a coup was planned in Turkey, and then we know that Turkey itself brought law, the action which was taken against them people, the Gulen and his followers, that was unprecedented in Turkey itself. So unprecedented measures must be taken, because we know whatever happened in May, that was something that was taking Pakistan to a verge of collapse, and of course a civil war was just around the corner. I think we must hail the Pakistan security forces that they abstained from using the guns, because that day, I mean, people who were defending them positions and them, Jinnah House and all of these locations, they are trained to kill. But that day they had no orders from the top officers saying them that these are our own population, our own people, so no gun would be used. And I think they abstained from violence at that day. But now is the chance that the law must take its course, and the people who were miscreants that day, they must be brought to justice.
Right, absolutely. And of course, we have the Supreme Court ruling now, and hopefully that is what is going to be the case moving forward. And we're going to be seeing the trials proceed, and of course, justice also being given to those who are involved. Mr. Munib, I'd also request you to stay for our next segment and get your input on what is going on internationally with reference to India and the United States, and how exactly is the discussion around the assassination plot that was thwarted by the U.S. authorities now being investigated by India upon the U.S. request, as well as taking place, and how that's going to impact its relations. And I want to understand, of course, when we talk about international law and the respect of sovereignty, a lot of that, of course, has been violated. But when we talk about investigations taking place and the involvement of a particular state in whatever has also transpired, how then is it that when we move forward with the results of that particular investigation, we can actually trust it and count on it as being credible, and making sure that those who were actually involved are going to be part of whatever result that may come out? Because if there is involvement at the state level, and the U.S. authorities have also claimed that there is credible evidence there is, then how will the authorities ever come out with a clear or fair investigation?
First of all, again, on an international level, this is a matter of national security for both Canada and the United States, because they've both claimed that they have credible evidence. In Canada's case, that dissident, he was assassinated on Canadian soil by people who were hand in gloves with the Indian government and Indian intelligence agencies. And then the United States of America is also alleging that the Indian intelligence agencies were involved, and they claim that they have credible evidence to that effect, in an assassination attempt on a Sikh separatist residing in America. Both of these are very serious accusations. Now, how the investigation is to be done, I think that the Canadian government and the American administration, they would know that the best. I mean, they wouldn't even have made such claims in the first place had they not done their investigation. Now, the thing here is that somehow there's this attitude which is adopted by India that they are, a new superpower in their own right, and so they can get away with anything. And if you listen to their own retired military officers on what is known as, the Indian media or Modi media, they very proudly claim, and they say something that we'll enter into your house and we will do the deed. This is what they literally say in Hindi. And I think that attitude is now showing in the high-handedness with which they are dealing with, even superpowers like America, or the kind of aggressive rhetoric that they were directing at Canada. I remember that they had expelled Canadian diplomats and had, brought an end to diplomatic relations between Canada and India. And they did not fear for one second what kind of repercussions it could have on India's trade relations and otherwise its global standing. They've got this sense of superiority ever since the BJP rule has come into power. It's like far right-wing government sitting in India with this sense of superiority. So all I can say is that when you've got two extremely important players of the international stage, of the international community, accusing, and they don't accuse you of, carrying out acts of aggression on their soil, especially if you're a potential ally. And India was seen as a very important ally by America in particular, as a sort of a buffer against the power that China was wielding in the region. And they're still accusing India of this. They wouldn't want to jeopardize their relations with India within the region unless they really had done the investigation. So it appears that they've already done it.
Right. Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Munib Qadir, for joining us and being part of our discussion. And Farrukh, I'd like your perspective also when we try and see what is going on, especially in terms of India's Republic Day celebrations, and how we now know that the president will not be taking part. There seems to be a lot of impact in terms of the bilateral relationship between India and the US. However, whenever we have talked about any other action taken by India and have asked for consequences, we haven't really seen them. Do you think that this perhaps will result in something substantially different in terms of India's position, both politically and economically, with countries like the US and Canada?
Right, Sana. First of all, regarding this cancellation of visit, I think it is huge, huge deal. As someone who has actually participated in one of India's Republic Days, I know the sentimental value, the prestige, angle that India attaches to this event. So the U.S. president not going there is huge, huge development. Now, regarding the consequences, I think what you're seeing, Sana, right now is gradual emboldening of a bully, a card-carrying bully. And for that, you don't have to actually look far away. The Dovell doctrine actually speaks to this, that they are not merely actually going to fight people that they think are against their interests, but they are going to cross international boundaries and then kill people as well. It was acceptable to the West till it was Pakistan, or for that matter Central Asia, where India could get away with murder. But then they started attacking their own benefactors. Remember, the intelligence agencies of Five Eyes, the countries that are Five Eyes, right? They have been the biggest champions of India's mainstreaming. And these people did not realize that when they are going against their nationals, they are perfectly, permanently going to create a kind of schism that is going to be there and will come back to haunt them. When Canada episode actually surfaced, at that time also, I told you that this matter will continue to snowball, and because India's present government is totally incapable to take a step back, we will see a gradual estrangement of Western allies. And that's why if you open any Western publication, the ones which were shouting atop their voices only a few months ago or a few years ago that India is the biggest ally in containment of China, now they are asking questions like, while India and America or West might share their interests, why is it that they don't share the values? And I think that realization is going to continue to increase. And till Narendra Modi is there, this is going to keep on, increasing frustration in Western capitals. And eventually, of course, one day either Modi will go, or then when it comes to India, India by that time would have lost all of its leverage in the Western society.
Right, and Faisal, it's not just the Republic Day celebrations; it's also the Quad Leaders Summit, and of course the alliance in itself is something that is very important to India. And so, whether or not, of course, one summit is going to be participated by the U.S. or not, or whether or not it's postponed, the idea that we don't have the United States representation as part of the Quad Summit now or perhaps later is also something which puts a major blow to India. How exactly do you think will this then continue moving forward when we talk about this particular alliance and the way that India is taking a look at it?
Yes, Sana, obviously, if we look at this, the whole episode which we are obviously, experiencing right now, there are two aspects of it. Number one, the existence of India. Of course, India has always been, hailed as a country that is a secular country, and having all of the minorities are having rights, equal rights, and all of the minorities are obviously part of this republic. And coming a decision from President Biden saying that he is not coming to the Republic Day of India as a chief guest, it is a statement which actually shows the mirror to the India as a state that you are not a secular state. You are a state that is dealing with its minorities very oddly. Not only domestically, of course, you are treating them very bad at home, but when it comes to the overseas, especially I'm talking about whatever happened with the Nijjar's case in Canada, and then nearly got killed Punnu, who was at the list of the hitman who was also paid in America, in New York, which was taking place, and of course it was probed, and it was unearthed that India as a state is behind it. So all of these things taking place, of course, India is deeply in trouble. And the second part which I wanted to highlight is, of course, the recent India, the modern India, in which we see that India is the key player in South China Sea, and of course India portrays itself as a threat to China and an ally to the Western countries. And of course Quad, members of Quad, of course, when it comes to India, especially the current government, Modi, he keeps on giving too much importance to Quad, because he uses this Quad narrative to gain votes in the elections, because it is good to show to the world that, of course, and to the people at large, that he is well aligned with with the powers of the world. So here, the decision of President Biden not coming to India is a huge setback for obviously Indian ambitions in the region, and obviously the Indian ambitions, the Modi's ambitions for his elections as well. As I know that in recent times they have been promoting in their election rallies as well, that next year, of course, the Quad meeting is going to take place. All of the important leaders of the world, they will be coming to India, and of course Modi is bringing them. So the Modi factor in the elections, I think it is going to be a very negative, the statements coming from the Washington, they are going to impact very negatively for Modi in the coming up elections.
Right,
as well.
and they already are, of course, as has been pointed out. But thank you, Faisal, and thank you for your input. And of course, much remains to be seen as to how exactly this will evolve. But we are, of course, all waiting for how the investigation actually comes out. But it is clear by these decisions, such as that of the Indian Republic Day not being attended by the US President, that there are going to be serious consequences, as there should be, for any violation of international law. And of course, we hope that that also transcends to not just certain actions with certain countries, but also in terms of what is going on both inside India and also in the occupied territory. That's all that we have from the debate. We'll now see you tomorrow.